Hi, I'm Tawny Plattis, and you're listening to Dirty Bits, the show that explores the sexy, scandalous, and salacious stories from history your teacher probably left out. If you're a love bug or a dirty birdie, as we call our Patreon supporters, stay tuned after the episode for listener shoutouts, special insider info, and podcast recommendations from the Dirty Bits newsroom you won't want to miss. Enjoy the show. Last week on Taking on the Tudors, Isabeau, a Bavarian daughter of a duke, married Charles VI, King of France. Her daughter, Catherine Valois, married Henry Lancaster V, the King of England. King Henry V of England dies. Charles VI, King of France, dies. And Henry VI, the infant son of Catherine Valois, becomes the King of England and France. So Catherine Valois was the youngest daughter of King Charles VI of France and his wife, Queen Isabeau, the daughter of a duke in Bavaria. Early in her life, they were already making plans to marry her to Henry V, the son of the King of England. At the time, it wasn't uncommon to marry off your kids if you were royalty when they were super duper young. Catherine's own sister was married to Richard II, the dude who was King of England back in 1396, before she had turned 7 years old. But interestingly, it also wasn't totally chill with everyone. You know, the whole child marriage thing. Like during the negotiations, a couple of people were all, she's still getting the whole reading thing down. You know that, right? She definitely doesn't know the Fresh Prince lyrics. She's way too young for you, bro. And King Richard II goes, oh my God, you guys, it's seriously no big deal. I'm young, I can wait. And she's young enough so we can mold her to be exactly what I want, like she's a puppy we're training and not an independent person who may not like that. And everyone goes, okay, cool, seems super legit and not damaging at all, let's go for it. And Isabella, Catherine's younger sister who's gonna marry this guy, is 6, so she's stoked because she gets to be a queen and the whole child bride thing goes over her head because she's totally Sansa Stark and is just jazzed to be this great lady. They had this big-ass French wedding, and King Richard II took her back to England afterwards, and supposedly they got along pretty darn well. He was said to have treated her really respectfully, was entertaining, and Isabella allegedly looked forward to when he'd come visit her. Now, when King Richard returns from dealing with the Irish, who were being all kinds of rebellious, he's imprisoned, dies in custody, and his cousin, Henry, takes over the English throne and becomes King Henry IV. So Henry IV waltzes on up to Isabella and is like, sorry I killed your husband, maybe you marry my son? You're the ripe age of 11 and a widow, so let's hop to it here, Izzy. To which she promptly replied, you can go fuck yourself, and went back to France. So the king goes, okay, fine. I'm keeping your dowry, though. And also, I heard you have a new baby sister. Think she'd be down with my son? But before they can even begin the marriage negotiations for the infant bride, Catherine Valois, Henry IV gets some mysterious disease that may have been leprosy, and he croaks. His son, Henry V, takes over when he's 27 years old, which kind of floored me considering the vast majority of people have no business running anything at that age. And he hits up Catherine Valois. She was reported to be a total babe, and when he laid eyes on her, Henry V was completely smitten. So even though he's waging war on France, he's like, we need to figure something out because this gal is the lady for me. So after that peace treaty of Troyes gets all squared away between the countries, they get married, and Catherine goes back to England with her new husband. He takes about 5 minutes before he gives her a little peck on the cheek and goes, okay, babe, I'm off to go tear shit up in your home country that your parents rule. Okay, bye. And Catherine says, what the actual fiery hell, bro? I am several months pregnant with your child, and you're just gonna peace out? And Henry goes, yeah, I am. For realsies, I gotta go, okay, bye. Which was not the best idea because he died of dysentery while on campaign just before he turned 36. Catherine was 20 and had given birth to her son just some months before, a son that her husband never even saw. That son was Henry VI, the youngest king to ever ascend to the English throne at the age of just 9 months old. This was kind of tripping out the Lord Protector, the dude who would rule until Henry VI was old enough to take the reins, because Catherine was still super young and hot, so everyone was wanting to put a ring on it. So Guy makes up this rule that if Catherine remarried without the king's consent, her husband would forfeit his lands and possessions. However, any children of the marriage would not suffer any punishment. This was passed when the king was only 6 years old, so Catherine would be waiting quite a while before she got married again. She lived in the king's household and supposedly doted on him, which the counselors were super down with because they could keep an eye on her. But that stopped her all of 0% from finding a boyfriend. The Welshman, Owen Tudor, that she fell in love with, was likely the keeper of the wardrobe in her household. There isn't a ton known about him, with rumors all over the place. Some saying that he was the bastard son of an alehouse keeper, his father was a fugitive murderer, and that he met the queen by falling into her lap while dancing, or that she was creeping on him while he was swimming. Any way you slice it, they started hooking up when she was living in the king's household and gave birth to their first child during that time. Altogether, the couple is said to have had at least 4 children. What's interesting about their relationship is that it isn't clear if they were actually married or not. Historian Bert Fields says that besides Owen Tudor's word, there isn't any evidence that they were ever actually wed. So Catherine ends up dying in 1437 from a mysterious illness, just 3 days after writing her will. Owen Tudor immediately gets a visit from some dudes who were pissed off that he had violated the rule that said the queen couldn't get married until her son, the king, was old enough to rule. They throw his ass in jail, but he escapes, gets caught, and is again imprisoned. King Henry VI pardons the father of his half-siblings when he's around 17 years old, and is like, give him back all his lands, titles, just give him all his shit back, you guys. He's my brother's dad. That wasn't cool to do all that shit to him for so long. Not cool, guys. We need to give him a job and a pension, too. He then brings Owen Tudor's sons, his half-brothers, Jasper and Edmund, to court, and he acknowledges them as his legit brothers, not just illegitimate bastards, and they're given titles like Earl. So everything is actually pretty groovy for the Tudors until Henry snaps during the 100 Years' War with the French. When he found out they lost Bordeaux, he had a total mental breakdown and was completely unresponsive for a year. He didn't even respond when his son was born or during his christening. Modern experts describe him as suffering from schizophrenia, and the fact that his maternal grandfather was Charles VI, King of France from last week's episode makes it fairly likely that there was some mental illness going on there. When he regains his senses, the War of the Roses starts up between the Lancasters and the Yorks. Henry VI was a Lancaster, and the son of the dude who was going to inherit the crown before Henry was born was a guy named Edward York. So much of history is just people fighting for power. They cover that in school, though, and these guys weren't particularly sexy, so we don't particularly care. Henry eventually gets defeated by the Yorkies.
Those are dogs, babe.
What?
Yorkies are dogs.
I know, it makes it sound cuter.
You want to be accurate or you want to be cute?
Right, because the dialogue I'm using in this show is lifted verbatim from the pages of history. I'm totally sure these people said shit like, "K, bye!" Anyway, Henry VI is defeated by some adorable puppies.
Oh my god.
And was held captive in the Tower of London. He was likely ordered murdered by Edward York, who was crowned King Edward IV of England the next morning. This results in the Yorks being in the monarchy for about 24 years until, get this, Henry Tudor, son of Edmund Tudor, who was Catherine Valois' son, and King Henry VI's half-brother, rolls up on the battlefield like, "What up, bitches?" with a shit ton of troops and equipment provided quite eagerly by the French. Henry Tudor kills Richard York and becomes Henry VII, King of England. Henry VII didn't seem to have a particularly sexy reign, but he did father one of history's most notoriously scandalous and salacious monarchs, Henry VIII. Henry VIII was never supposed to be king. His older brother Arthur died from the sweating sickness when he was 15, just 20 weeks after he married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Queen Isabella of Spain, who was the very same Isabella responsible for Christopher Columbus wreaking havoc in the Americas. And Catherine was such a rad person. She was extremely educated, and her influence made it trendy for women to pursue an interest in academia. And then she started this widespread program for poverty relief, and when the country was at war with France for the nth time, She rode in full armor, super pregnant, just to address the troops. So everyone is like, Henry VIII, you're next in line to become King of England. What are you gonna do next? And Henry is like, I'm 10. I'm going to Disney World. King Henry VII's oldest son's death threw him for a loop, and then his wife died, so he was completely heartbroken. He didn't really do anything to prepare his younger son to be king. The adults in his life were helicopter types, and he never made public appearances. So by the time he was ready to rule, he was about as prepared as a plumber for a ballet recital. Henry VIII was engaged to his brother's widow by the age of 11, and things got politically messy to the point where Henry was like, I don't even want to marry her anymore. When he was 14, and Catherine is in this whole weird, am I going to marry him or not limbo for years. But when Henry's dad dies and he becomes king at the age of 17, he just abruptly goes, oh, BT dubs, I am going to marry Catherine of Aragon. It was my father's dying wish, so screw you, I'm king. And everyone is like, okay, but what about that Bible verse, Leviticus 18:16, that says you can't marry your brother's wife? And Catherine of Aragon goes, well, we actually never slept together. So Pope Julius II, who wasn't so squeaky clean himself, and most definitely needs a mini episode on Patreon, goes, that's squaresies with canon law. It's totes cool if you didn't do the deed. So they get married, have these crazy-ass parties, he's coronated, and promptly arrests his father's least two popular ministers, having them executed by the following year. And King Henry VIII sits back and goes, holy shit, I can just kill people if they're in my way? This is awesome. Catherine became pregnant soon after, which according to the church meant that she couldn't fulfill her wifely duties. So Henry VIII thinks, good thing she has those foxy ladies in waiting. I have to mention that it's disputed among historians to what extent Henry got around. There are only 2 mistresses that can be confirmed without debate, which is considered low for a sexy young king at the time. The lack of details surrounding his exploits actually kinda showcased the discretion that he used when compared to, say, one of his successors, Charles II. One of Henry VIII's mistresses, Elizabeth Blount, has next to no surviving juicy deets. We know that she worked for the Queen when Henry noticed her, and that their relationship lasted an impressive 8 years. She gave birth to their son, Henry Fitzroy. Henry after his father, and Fitzroy roughly translating to son of the king. He was the only one of the king's bastards to be acknowledged by him, probably because Catherine, try as she might, wasn't popping out any babies of the masculine variety, which was a pretty substantial part of her job description. It was such a big deal that there was evidence that the king could in fact produce a child with a penis that it inspired this saying, bless ye Blount. Catherine would go on to give birth to only one surviving child, a girl, Mary Tudor. After Henry Fitzroy was born, the affair between the king and Bessie ended without any concrete explanation, though it's often speculated that he broke up with Elizabeth to pursue a new gal he was crushing on, Mary Boleyn. Mary Boleyn began her career as a lady-in-waiting to King Henry VIII's sister, who was marrying King Louis XII of France. She supposedly had numerous affairs, with some evidence suggesting she was swap and spit with the King of France himself. And though historians largely believe that the stories about her were exaggerated, there is evidence that the King of France called her, and I swear to God these are quotes from history, the English mare, my hackney, which I had to Google, and it means horse, and a very great whore, the most infamous of all. When Mary Boleyn gets back to England, she marries this guy named William Carey, and then begins sleeping with Henry VIII. He again conducted the affair with the utmost discretion, and little is known about all the gory details. However, we do know that she gave birth to 2 kids when she was seeing the king, and their paternity is still debated over to this day. Just throwing it out there, Ancestry.com has still only seemed to help us out with Warren G. Harding and friends, and it would be absolutely fantastic if they could answer these pressing genealogy questions we keep unearthing in what seems like every other episode. So they broke up, and Mary's sister, the 25-year-old Anne Boleyn, shows up to court with a plan. It's often been said that her sister was prettier, but Anne was far more intelligent, and ambitious. She gets a job with his wife, which seems to be a prerequisite for sleeping with the 34-year-old Henry VIII, and by 1526, the king was DTF. But Anne was like, "Oh no, I could never go to bed with a man who wasn't my husband." And Henry's like, "Are you serious?" And Anne's all, "Of course I am." Bitch wanted to be queen. So Henry is like, "Oh no, remember how I was like, I can totally marry Catherine of Aragon because she didn't sleep with my brother? I just found this Bible verse that is like, you totally can't marry your brother's wife. And the 40-year-old Catherine hasn't given me any man-children, so I'm assuming God is like super pissed. I think the only answer is to annul the marriage and marry the young 20-something-year-old Anne Boleyn, Mr. Pope. I mean, you can't say you know more than the Bible." This event that came to be known as the King's Great Matter sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The new Pope, Clement VII, was like, "I'd have to admit the last Pope messed up when you're the one who changes his mind more often than his underwear. No, not gonna happen, Enrique. I'm not doing it." And King Henry VIII's wife was pissed. Catherine of Aragon was all, "No, absolutely not. I 100% am your wife. We have not been living in sin, and you're not about to let your one surviving child become a bastard because you want to tap that so bad that you'd actually divorce me to marry her. Oh my God, what is wrong with you?" And the public seemed to agree with her. People called her Anne the King's Whore, or a naughty prostitute. And this one time when Anne was having dinner near the Thames, a group of angry women almost tore her to pieces before she narrowly escaped on a boat. But Henry tells her and everyone else, including the Pope, "I do what I want. I'm the King of England, bitch." And he banishes his wife from court and gives her rooms to his new girlfriend. King Henry then goes on to appoint one of his buds as Archbishop of Canterbury and goes, "Hey, I'm going to need you to authorize this divorce for me. I'm going to make my own church too, no big deal." And the Archbishop goes, "Say no more, fam." And in 1533, when the king was 41 and Anne was 32, they were married in secret. Anne was pregnant in like half a second, and the Archbishop goes, "It's legal, cake and champagne for everyone." Catherine is stripped of her title as queen. Anne Boleyn is crowned as consort. His daughter Mary is declared illegitimate, and that same year, Anne gives birth to Elizabeth I. Henry flips off the Pope in Rome by beginning the Church of England, to which the Pope responded with an even bigger bird by excommunicating Henry and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who told him it was chill to get a divorce. Immediately, the marriage had problems. Anne wasn't the type to be the quiet, obedient housewife. Ironically, the spunky, smart spirit that Henry was so enamored with didn't translate over into queen-like behavior. In other words, she was a good girlfriend, but not a good wife, in his eyes. Anne was said to be pissy, had a violent temper, and she had the cojones to betray him by not having a son. Rude. Henry was like, "God, this broad is awful. At least Catherine knew how to queen. Maybe we should get back together. Ugh, I don't know what to do. Wait, who's that hot lady in waiting my wife has over there? Hold my beer." Meanwhile, Catherine is living in this castle and was separated from her daughter. They were forbidden to communicate, but sympathizers smuggled letters between the two back and forth. She had become increasingly more religious, wearing incredibly uncomfortable, itchy clothing, fasting, and confining herself to her room unless she was in church. Her staff continued to refer to her as the Queen because, honestly, fuck Henry. Catherine died under unknown circumstances in 1535. At the time, it was rumored she was poisoned, but those claims are now considered unsubstantiated. Historians now think she died of cancer, depression, or simply a broken heart. The people of England mourned, but Henry and Anne were said to have worn yellow, which is kind of tough to judge because in their own country, yellow was a symbol of joy. But in Spain, where Catherine was from, it was a color of mourning. They also threw a party, though, so I'm assuming they were just being assholes. Anne became pregnant again, and her stress levels were up to here. Now that Catherine was dead, absolutely nothing prevented Henry from remarrying if she didn't give him a prince. And that's when Henry's ever-wandering eye stopped on Jane Seymour, who fulfilled the "you can boink the king" prerequisite of being a lady-in-waiting to his wife. On top of all of that, Henry was flung from his horse and rendered unconscious in a tournament. When Anne found out about the incident on the day that Catherine of Aragon was buried, she miscarried a little prince. One ambassador said she had miscarried of her savior. Most historians agree that's when the royal marriage fell apart, and Henry was then all about the young 20-something Jane Seymour. And he was honestly kind of a dick about it. He had absolutely no consideration for Anne. There was this one time that Anne came into a room, right before her miscarriage actually, and saw Jane Seymour sitting on her husband's lap. Notorious for her Real Housewives-like temper, she lost her shit, which some historians think may have led to her losing her unborn child, as opposed to Henry's jousting accident. Then, Henry gave Jane Seymour a locket with his portrait inside. Jane was super bitchy about it. She flaunted the jewelry in front of Anne, opening and closing the necklace in front of her. Anne responded by ripping the locket off her neck so violently, her fingers actually bled. The king responded with a shrug and attitude that conveyed a sense of "bitches be cray," and moved Jane Seymour into a more lavish part of the palace. During this time, Anne was accused of adultery, Cersei Lannister-type incest, and treason. 5 men, including her own brother, were arrested for shacking up with Anne. The rumor went that she was plotting with all of her lovers to kill the king. To this day, historians still argue about the evidence provided that convicted the queen, though most believe Henry was just making shit up with his lawyer buddy because he wanted to be with Jane Seymour. They arrested this Flemish musician and tortured him until he confessed to sleeping with Anne. They then arrested, but didn't torture, a nobleman, Henry Norris, because, that would just be crossing the line to torture a nobleman. And he was adamant about not only his own innocence, but the queen's. However, someone was like, I overheard the queen get jelly over the fact that Norris was visiting one of her ladies-in-waiting instead of her. Then on top of it all, the Archbishop of Canterbury goes, oh, that marriage between the king and Anne? Gonna go ahead and void that. And in the 16th century, that was enough to behead someone. Anne was royally screwed, and all of the accused were executed just a few days later. Many of you are familiar with the rumors that circulated about Anne, but most, if not all of them, are unsubstantiated legends. The rumor about her having 6 fingers on her right hand was total bullshit. Henry never would have been with her in the first place, because any physical abnormalities were considered evil at the time. And furthermore, when her body was exhumed in 1876, nothing out of the ordinary was discovered. Her heart wasn't separated from her body and buried in Suffolk. Her final resting place was in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter and Vincula. The next day, Henry and Jane Seymour get engaged only to be married 10 days later, making her wife number 3 in 3 years. She was never coronated because there was plague in London at the time, but Henry may actually have been shy to crown his new bride until she gave him a son. Jane Seymour had a reputation for being gentle, meek, and peaceful. She showed compassion and support for Catherine of Aragon before she passed away, which made her England's sweetheart. She was also way more uptight than Anne Boleyn, who was a notorious party animal. Jane's household was all about strict formality. She banned all the cute French clothes that Anne had been such a fan of, and she became tight with Princess Mary Tudor, the king's daughter from his first marriage. But when she tried to become involved with politics, Henry politely took her aside and said, "Did you see what happened to the last woman in my life who got too involved in my business?" To which Jane replied, "Noted," and turned her efforts to restoring Princess Mary to the line of succession. She didn't accomplish her goal, but it's sweet to think of her being friends with the young girl who had been cast aside by her own father. In 1537, Jane Seymour became pregnant, quietly lived her life in the castle while being attended by the best doctors and midwives, and had intense quail cravings. I'm assuming because ice cream wasn't readily available to go with her pickles. She gave birth to a boy, Edward, after a difficult labor that lasted 3 days and 2 nights. likely because the baby was in an awkward position. After his christening, it became clear that something wasn't right with Jane. 12 days after her son was born, she died from what may have been either an infection from a retained placenta or puerperal fever, following a bacterial infection contracted during the birth. From what I gather, Henry seemed to actually be devastated at the death of the short-ruling queen. He wore black for 3 months, put on weight to the point of reaching obesity, developed diabetes, gout, and was described as being swollen. He didn't marry for 3 years, and when he eventually died much later, he was buried beside Jane upon his request. Knowing Henry, she was likely his favorite wife for the simple fact that she was able to give him a son. So after a couple years, his counselors are like, so, probably a good idea to get married? How about this Anne of Cleves person? And if you don't like her, she has a sister. They can't exactly send us selfies, so have that painter Hans go work on some portraits. And Henry goes, brilliant! Hans, I need you to go down to do some recon. Can I get you to pop over to Germany and paint a couple of women's pictures for me? And I cannot stress this enough, they need to be accurate. You feel me? And Hans is like, yeah, no worries, I got this. 2 accurate paintings coming right up. So Hans goes to Dusseldorf and sends back some paintings. Henry looks at Anne and likes what he sees. She was also described as having all the good characteristics of a queen. In other words, she didn't rock the boat like wife number 2. So Henry invites her over for Netflix and chill, and Anne goes, super down, on my way. But when she arrives, Henry's jaw hits the floor like a cartoon, and he's like, you don't look anything like your pictures. Supposedly, Hans had either painted her in a more flattering light, which seems kind of unlikely considering he continued working at court and was in everybody's good graces, and it wasn't like Henry was shy to start swinging an axe, or his lawyer buddy, Cromwell, had exaggerated Anne's beauty. Henry is quoted as having said, she is nothing so fair as she hath been reported. And Henry's like, Cromwell, you bastard, I'm not marrying that horse-faced, smelly, saggy-breasted, uneducated German chick. But Cromwell goes, dude, you have to marry her. We need a German-English alliance. Time to put on your big girl panties, and here's a tall glass of get the hell over it with a straw so you can suck it up. So they get married in January of 1540, and their wedding night did not go well. He told Cromwell the next day he couldn't bring himself to consummate the marriage, saying, I liked her before not well, but now I like her much worse. By June, she was asked to leave court, and when July rolled around, she was told that Henry was reconsidering the marriage. When asked for an annulment, Anne didn't put up a fight about it and quickly agreed, which you have to imagine was a wise choice when considering the fate of wife number 2. He divorced Anne on the grounds that the marriage was unconsummated, and, if I'm understanding correctly, had his physician give a statement proving that Henry really couldn't get it up for Anne because he was having wet dreams, which was problematic when trying to secure an heir. Henry also ordered Cromwell's beheading, for all the inconvenience. After the divorce, Anne received a hefty settlement, and the two actually remained friends, with the king referring to her as his beloved sister. She was often invited to court, and because she was so laid back about their divorce, it was said she was given precedent over every single woman in England, besides the king's future wife and daughters. Not bad for a stupid, stinky German woman with a horse face. Henry soon set his sights on, surprise, surprise, Anne of Cleves' lady-in-waiting, the 17-year-old Catherine Howard, who would become wife number 5, and whose mother was sister to Anne Boleyn's own mother, making her first cousins with wife number 2. Catherine Howard had been sent to live with aristocratic relatives at the age of 5, and apparently it was like Lord of the Flies up in there. There was next to no supervision, and Catherine was influenced by the older girls who had guys in their bedroom at night, for which they were given wine, food, and other gifts. Her education could be described as and she was giggly, fun, may have had ADD, and really loved dogs. She sounds like a fantastic person to me. Catherine started dallying around with the secretary of the Dowager Duchess she was staying with when she was 15. They called each other husband and wife, and may have planned on marrying, but the relationship ended when the Dowager Duchess discovered them. So Catherine is a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, And after the divorce is all finalized, Henry starts moving in on the teenager. He gives her all these cute clothes and huge tracts of land and calls her his rose without a thorn and the very jewel of womanhood. They were married the same day Cromwell literally lost his head on July 28, 1540. She was considered too young and ditzy to take part in matters of state, and Henry gave in to her every whim. They spent a grip of money celebrating their marriage, and Catherine was constantly sporting expensive dresses and jewelry. This was also around the time that the king, who was already considered moody, in what might be the biggest understatement I've ever said on this show, he accused counselors of being lying time servers, and he started to miss his pal Cromwell. Catherine was supposedly hooking up with one of Henry's favorite male courtiers in just a few months after marrying him. The guy was Thomas Culpeper, and he had written the Queen, calling her "my little sweet fool" in one of his letters, and she had even thought about marrying him when she was serving Anne of Cleves before she married Henry VIII. They would have one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting arrange their meetings, but people at court found out, and she had already had a reputation from her teenage years, so she had to start paying them off for their silence and discretion. But the Archbishop of Canterbury gets wind of the rumors and begins his investigation. He finds a love letter in Thomas Culpeper's room, in Queen Catherine Howard's recognizable handwriting. Today it is the only surviving letter from their affair. He also found out about her liaison with the Dowager Duchess's secretary. She told him all about it. Then on All Saints' Day, Henry is presented with a warrant for his wife's arrest, and she is questioned just days later. She was freaking out so bad that even the guy questioning her said, "I found her in such lamentation and heaviness as I never saw no creature, so that it would have pitied any man's heart to have looked upon her." He then had the guards remove anything from her room that she could use to commit suicide. About a month later, Catherine's boyfriend, Thomas Culpeper, was beheaded for treason, aka hooking up with the king's lady, and his head was placed on a spike, as was tradition. Her ex, the Dowager Duchess's secretary, was also imprisoned, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Then Catherine herself was imprisoned, and Henry got super bummed, and that's when he began turning to food for comfort. In 1541, the Royal Assent by Commission Act made it a treasonous act punishable by death for the king's wife to fail to disclose her sexual history to her husband within 20 days of their wedding, in addition to inciting someone to commit adultery with her, which made the whole Catherine sitch very cut and dry. When the Lords of Council came to escort her to the Tower where she'd be executed, she straight up screamed and panicked to the point that they had to manhandle her to get her moved. It's said that she practiced putting her head on the executioner's block for hours the night before her beheading. She reportedly was relatively composed, though pale and terrified, and said her punishment was worth and just. All the usual stuff before a beheading. Folklore says that her final words were, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." But there isn't any evidence to support this actually happened. She died with one swing of the axe. In 1543, the sixth time seemed to be the charm when Henry married his final wife, Catherine Parr. She was a rock star and was incredibly kind to Henry's 3 children, even reinstating his daughters in the line of succession, meaning they were no longer bastards and considered legitimate issue. She was his regent who ruled while he was gone on war campaigns. She was almost arrested and could have faced the same fate as her predecessors for having Protestant sympathies. At about the same time, there were rumors circulating that the king was attracted to her bestie, the Duchess of Suffolk. So Catherine Parr realizes what's going on and goes, "Oh shit, I need to figure this out." And she reconciles with the king, telling him, "Oh God, babe, Protestant? No. I was just chatting about religion because of those ulcers in your leg. I know they hurt a ton and I was just trying to distract you. Come on, you know I'm all about the Church of England." And it worked. They stayed together until Henry's death in 1547. He had become obese with a waist measurement of 54 inches and couldn't move without the help of machines that had been designed just for him. He was covered in painful, pus-filled boils, had gout, possibly had scurvy, and definitely had a festering, ulcerated wound from jousting. In fact, it was the jousting incident that historians say may have caused his dramatic change in personality that resulted in his erratic behavior and rapid weight gain later in life. So let's recap. In 1385, Isabeau of Bavaria marries King Charles VI of France. They have a bunch of kids, and he starts struggling with what is likely schizophrenia. Their daughter, Catherine Valois, marries Henry V, King of England. She has one kid with him who grows up to become Henry VI. When her husband dies, she has a kid with her boyfriend, who may have secretly been her husband, Owen Tudor. They named their son Edmund Tudor. So Catherine's son, Henry VI, dies, and Edward York becomes king. A few years pass, and Catherine's son Edmund has a kid who nabs the throne in 1485 and becomes Henry VII. None of these people had particularly interesting sex lives that survived history, so we glossed over most of that. Henry VIII surprisingly becomes king after his older brother dies, and he marries his widow, Catherine of Aragon. They have a daughter, Mary Tudor, but no sons. He soon learns that he can chop off heads of people standing in his way, develops a lady-in-waiting fetish, sleeps around, starts his own church so he can do whatever the hell he wants, and divorces his wife. He then marries Anne Boleyn, who everyone hates, and eventually accuses her of incest and treason when she doesn't give him a son, just a daughter, Elizabeth. It's off with Anne's head in the evening, an engagement party with the young Jane Seymour in the morning. Wife number 3, Jane Seymour, who seemed like she would have been a great queen, dies shortly after giving birth to her and Henry's only son, Edward. He then married Anne of Cleves, but didn't meet her before they were engaged, and he thought she was absolutely repulsive. But he went ahead with the marriage because he needed a German-English alliance, and his best friend told him he had to do it. He annulled his marriage to Anne, and she was smart enough to position herself so she became like a sister to him, and had a pretty sweet happily ever after. Henry's friend was executed for slipping up on being a wingman. Henry then married Catherine Howard, who ended up being a floozy, cheated on him, and was arrested before being beheaded for treason. He finally married Catherine Parr, who had what seemed to be a fairly scandal-free relationship before he died in 1547, leaving his young son, Edward, the King of England. And that was the most complicated part of the scandalous and salacious stories from the House of Tudor. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or corrections for me, feel free to email us at tawny@tawnyvoice.com, or let us know on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or on our website, tawnyvoice.com. See you next Tuesday. The following may make your head pop unless you're a Dirty Bits podcast fan that can differentiate between a love bug and a dirty birdie. Listener discretion advised. Welcome to the Dirty Bits newsroom. The after show that updates our hardcore fans that we love the most on all the fun and exciting upcoming features on the show. Thank you so much to our Dirty Birdies for joining us this week for our live episode of the Dirty Bits podcast on Patreon. We hope you enjoyed this special look at what goes into making an episode, and look forward to seeing you next week for the final part of our special, Taking on the Tudors, the mini-series, where we'll cover Queen Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I, and many more. As some of you know, we've recently joined the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We're proud to be a part of a wonderful pod family and have some brothers and sisters on the network we think you'd positively adore. Visit orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can discover high-quality, entertaining, and educational shows like Insight and Insight Junior, 4-1 Owned, Historium, The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Is This Adulting?, California Dreaming, and Super Nerds UK. OrbitalJigsaw.com is now home to the Dirty Bits merchandise store, where you can find positively adorbs swag like phone cases, stickers, t-shirts, baby onesies, mugs, notebooks, and much more. Be sure to join us on social media, where we'll be doing giveaways of exciting new merchandise every week. When you sign up for our email list, you'll automatically be entered to win Positively Adorbs merchandise from ATH Fiber Arts or goodies from our very own Dirty Bits merchandise selection. We love talking with our listeners and would be delighted if you joined in with us. You might even get a shout out on our next episode. Like the Positively Adorbs love bug who made our friggin' week with this sweet as sugar review from Melissa0296 on iTunes. I adore this podcast. I am a huge fan of history. At 8, I wanted to be an Egyptologist. I studied political theory and history in college, and this podcast has all the things that make me tick. History, politics, naughty bits, snark, and the best humor. Tawny is such a fun personality, and she really makes the podcast what it is. I listen to quite a few casts on my 50-mile round-trip drive to and from work each day, and I can say without a doubt that the Dirty Bits is the best 20 to 30 minutes of the week. Catherine the Great was a perfect starting episode, and others like Joyce, Curie, and others are such a fun and saucy listen. Thanks for what you do, Tawny, and keep them coming. You've definitely got a fan in me. Thanks, Melissa. You're too sweet. You can also find us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/dirtybitspodcast, and join our Facebook discussion group, the Dirty Bits Podcast Group, where we post art history memes and talk about all things historically filthy. You can also connect with us on Instagram at Dirty Bits Podcast and Twitter at the Dirty Bits Pod. We'd be positively overjoyed if you let us know how we're doing by leaving us a review on Facebook, iTunes, or just shooting an email over to tawny@tawnyvoice.com. All of our links are available in the show notes here and on our fabulous network's website, orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can find all of our pod brothers and pod sisters. Many of you have requested longer, bigger, more frequent episodes. We would absolutely love to bring the show to you full time. If that's something you would like to see, you can help us work towards making that a reality by visiting us at patreon.com/dirtybits and becoming an official Dirty Birdie. Every donation is a step towards achieving our goal of bringing more to the show, like animation, merchandise, live shows, tours, and much more. A giant thank you to our newest Dirty Birdies, Tammy DeWell, James Seabright, Melissa Nelson, Patty Glad, and Kelly Page, who have donated on Patreon. We are seriously overwhelmed by your generosity and are so excited to start sending you all of the patron-only goodies for your enjoyment. Every one of your contributions to the show means so much, especially to those who aren't able to donate. George and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Thank you for listening to these important updates from the Dirty Bits newsroom, love bugs, and Dirty Birdies. We'll see you next Tuesday. The after show that updates our hardcore fans that we love the most on all the fun and exciting upcoming features on the show. Thank you so much to our Dirty Birdies for joining us this week for our live episode of the Dirty Bits podcast on Patreon. We hope you enjoyed this special look at what goes into making an episode and look forward to seeing you next week for the final part of our special, Taking on the Tudors, the mini-series, where we'll cover Queen Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, Elizabeth I, and many more. As some of you know, we've recently joined the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We're proud to be a part of a wonderful pod family and have some brothers and sisters on the network we think you'd positively adore. Visit orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can discover high-quality, entertaining, and educational shows like Insight and Insight Junior, 4-1 Owned, Historium, The Concession Stand, Busted Wide Open, Is This Adulting?, California Dreaming, and Super Nerds UK. OrbitalJigsaw.com is now home to the Dirty Bits merchandise store, where you can find positively adorbs swag like phone cases, stickers, t-shirts, baby onesies, mugs, notebooks, and much more. Be sure to join us on social media, where we'll be doing giveaways of exciting new merchandise every week. When you sign up for our email list, you'll automatically be entered to win Positively Adorbs merchandise from ATH Fiber Arts or goodies from our very own Dirty Bits merchandise selection. We love talking with our listeners and would be delighted if you joined in with us. You might even get a shout out on our next episode. Like the Positively Adorbs love bug who made our friggin' week with this sweet as sugar review from Melissa0296 on iTunes. I adore this podcast. I am a huge fan of history. At 8, I wanted to be an Egyptologist. I studied political theory and history in college, and this podcast has all the things that make me tick: history, politics, naughty bits, snark, and the best humor. Tawny is such a fun personality, and she really makes the podcast what it is. I listen to quite a few casts on my 50-mile round-trip drive to and from work each day, and I can say without a doubt that the Dirty Bits is the best 20 to 30 minutes of the week. Catherine the Great was a perfect starting episode, and others like Joyce, Curie, and others are such a fun and saucy listen. Thanks for what you do, Tawny, and keep them coming. You've definitely got a fan in me. Thanks, Melissa. You're too sweet. You can also find us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/dirtybitspodcast, and join our Facebook discussion group, the Dirty Bits Podcast Group, where we post art history memes and talk about all things historically filthy. You can also connect with us on Instagram at Dirty Bits Podcast and Twitter at the Dirty Bits Pod. We'd be positively overjoyed if you let us know how we're doing by leaving us a review on Facebook, iTunes, or just shooting an email over to tawny@tawnyvoice.com. All of our links are available in the show notes here and on our fabulous network's website, orbitaljigsaw.com, where you can find all of our pod brothers and pod sisters. Many of you have requested longer, bigger, more frequent episodes. We would absolutely love to bring the show to you full-time. If that's something you would like to see, you can help us work towards making that a reality by visiting us at patreon.com/dirtybits and becoming an official Dirty Birdie. Every donation is a step towards achieving our goal of bringing more to the show, like animation, merchandise, live shows, tours, and much more. A giant thank you to our newest Dirty Birdies, Tammy DeWell, James Seabright, Melissa Nelson, Patty Glad, and Kelly Page, who have donated on Patreon. We are seriously overwhelmed by your generosity and are so excited to start sending you all of the patron-only goodies for your enjoyment. Every one of your contributions to the show means so much, especially to those who aren't able to donate. George and I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Thank you for listening to these important updates from the Dirty Bits newsroom. Love bugs.